Um, it almost never applies, but there are times when nothing else will do. All right, let's see. Sorry, because I've got email right here too. I keep this up and running just in case anyone emails and they're running late or something like that. Um, a couple of you emailed me you were having trouble with the power. Is that apparently not an issue right now? But just be aware. I'm aware of that. I don't know if I made it clear to you. Um, if if you get knocked offline, that's not your fault. So well, you know, it's just stupid power, right? It's power being stupid. So it's one of the reasons why I record the class and why when we get back into face-to-face teaching, you're going to miss that. You may miss anything else, but you're going to miss that because it's not going to be like, you know what, I can blow out the class today because Bill recorded it. And be like, no, he didn't. I hate Bill. He's stupid. You know, that kind of thing. All right. Yeah, I saw that thing pop up and I thought, oh my God, I've broken my screen. No, it's a raised hand.
I just had a quick question about the reading notes.
No, wait a minute. Did you
yes.
have a question about something like the reading notes, or did you actually have a question about the reading notes?
I have a question about the reading notes.
All right, very well.
For when we are presenting in the when we are presenting for this module, are we only doing the notes for the one we're presenting on?
Do the notes on everything.
Okay.
Yeah, it's better for you to do that because one of the things, there's so many things with this note thing that are useful. It doesn't actually create that much more work for you. And in some ways, it eliminates work downstream because, you know, I'm not just interested in you remembering the thing you present on or, you know, of the 5 readings assigned, the 2 that you summarize. My obligation is to try to teach you something about all of the readings, even the ones that are stinkers, you know. And when I've done some research on this, you know, it's not true. I've not done the research. I've read studies of people who've done the research on the functionality of writing something down and therefore being able to recall it to mind more easily and make better use of it. So I've tried that. And in some of the classes, like I think in 355, they're not doing notes. I try to have one class where they're not doing notes. It's not that they can't, they just don't do them in the journal function. And then I compare things like the writing quality, and because we have recordings, I can compare the quality of discussions. And it's pretty clear that the students who go in, fill out the notes, take that seriously, are always better prepared. It started with the idea that students were coming to class with the best of intentions, but no preparation. Thinking, well, Bill's going to explain these things. And then after Bill explains them, then maybe I'll go read them if I haven't taken good notes or something. And that's just inverting the process. And that's not learning, that's just filling gaps. And that's not really learning. It doesn't stimulate curiosity, and it doesn't allow you to achieve understanding. That's what rote memorization is fatal in that sense. So I try to do things that encourage you to engage with the material without making it incredibly laborious or without creating anxiety, like having extra quizzes or something like that. I mean, I hate that kind of stuff. So does that make sense? Yeah. And again, those notes, you pick your format. Some people's notes are kind of telegraphic, but I can tell from looking at them, oh, they're raising really good points here. And it might be written as a sequence of bullet points with the occasional kind of introspective reflection. Usually you put them in parentheses, which is kind of cool. It really allows me to see your thinking as you're engaging with the material. So it also alerts me to things that I might want to make sure to emphasize in discussions and things like that, right? So it's not meant to add more work for you. It's actually meant to make the material more accessible, okay? All right, are there any other general questions? I think all the grades there was only one late assignment, I think. So I think all the grades should be posted. Anybody have any trouble getting to your grade for the last written assignment? And also, again, if you presented, it's the same scale of points, but you haven't submitted a paper, but you can still look on Moodle and you can get a point value out of, I think the scale I'm using is out of 20. There's a certain way of calculating it and weighting it. Okay, What is there a particular order that you want to go in? Is there anybody who kind of wants to get it out of the way first, or can we just go sort of from top to bottom, starting with uses of violence? Any thoughts? Is that okay? Okay, if you're playing along at home, then we're going to begin with uses of violence. Professor Chapin.
Wonderful. It's pronounced Nyberg, the last name. You're muted.
Because I wanted to be quiet. I've heard it pronounced both Nieberg and Nyberg.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
I probably won't say it too much, but just for referencing.
It's okay.
This piece by Nyberg talks about the uses of violence, and he really begins the paper with his main thesis and main argument that outbreaks of violence, but like particularly, or more importantly, just the mere threat of violence, are both essential in conflict resolution in national and international settings, as well as in working for political and social change within those systems. And that the risk of violence is both necessary and useful in preserving societies, and that violence is the basis of social change. Nyberg discusses that there are two inseparable aspects to understanding violence, which is that the actual use of violence and the potential use of violence can't be unlinked from one another. They always go hand in hand with one another. Demonstrations of violence have to be enacted from time to time, he argues, to make the threat of violence credible. If the capability for a demonstrated act of violence isn't present, then the threat will have no political bargaining power. Nyberg also argues that then the overall goal of the threat of violence isn't about provoking actual or stoking actual violence, but rather it's a way to bargain and to accommodate differing interests in a system. And the overall goal of actual violence then is to give credibility to future threats of violence by demonstrating that this particular person or this particular group of people are capable of committing violence. In tandem, then, the goal of violence, like in totality together, is to just foster cooperation and to accommodate change in a democratic system. Nyberg then goes on to discuss that conceptually, we can understand that human relationships are running on this scale or continuum from being in states of consensus with one another or in states of competition, but goes on to say that relationships are actually way more complicated than that, because people occupy different roles or spaces in a system simultaneously, and the objectives of those objective circumstances that those roles may place or individuals may have will vary because of the fluctuating nature of the roles that you're a part of. Then he goes on to discuss more critically political roles in these systems that can be both formal or informal, being like work groups would be a type of group, like children's play groups was another example. Nation states or being part of the broader international system were also examples of political roles. And then each of these roles then have different values, different types of norms, patterns, agendas that everybody's required to adhere to. However, these demands in these roles do change. They're not fixed over time. And then these demands create this tension, which is felt in terms of that consensus to competition scale. Nyberg then starts discussing this idea of conflict, and conflict then needs to be understood in this as a way in which people discover a consensus with one another and work collaboratively with one another. He suggests that there's a constant effort by all individuals to improve their roles in the system or to impose their roles onto the larger system generally. But due to limits on an individual's power in these systems, credible threats of violence act as a way for them to induce a discussion around accommodations. However, not all people and systems are capable of using threats of violence to sway people equally. And this is because of their place in the overall status quo of the system. This part got kind of complicated, so I'm only going to focus on what I felt was the overarching part, was his discussion of law. Law as being what maintains the status quo in a political system. It's designed to shape the relationships and uphold the relationships that are the main part of the status quo. Pressures then for both political and societal change have to be substantial before the threat of violence can rise above the threshold of reserve. Well, how can I explain that better? Essentially, the way the state is formed is the state has like a threshold of reserves of violence and power for itself. So for violence to be able to be used in this type of system against the status quo and against the system, you have to meet or exceed the power that the status quo or the system holds for it to be a legitimate threat. He then goes on to talk kind of more extensively about how democratic societies allow for opposition to the status quo, and that insurgent groups are able to change the law when its capability of demonstrating violence can match that or exceed that of what the state has. And that's what stabilizes democratic societies in ways that more totalitarian regimes who try to hold a monopoly on violence just can't do. So essentially, by allowing participants in the system to exercise violence or threaten to exercise violence is what stabilizes it. Kind of lastly in this, there was also a discussion of private violence, which I don't think I quite understood that very well either. But he discusses that private violence is never tolerated in the system, and that just the mere threat of it being directed against the government can actually have great power over the government, because in trying to quell that violence, it'll pull resources from other areas that and other coalitions that then may become upset or underfunded, and that would strain those particular relationships. So governments kind of try to avoid that if they can. But yeah, going back to his main argument, though, he finishes out the paper by just discussing that no system can hope to survive unless it can live with and adjust itself to the multitudes of threats of violence, which are the basis of social change.
Okay, that's not bad. There's a lot in that article, but he lays it out pretty systematically. There are a few things where either a prior familiarity with his work or the work that's informing his work would make some of that stuff make a little more sense. But that's a pretty good summary and a pretty good analysis. It seems surprising, though, that someone writing about politics in 1963 would essentially be saying, hey, this violence thing, it's natural.
Yeah.
It's really what he's saying. In fact, not only is it natural, it's necessary. But part of that is the way, and he's not super clear about this, but at least by implication, the way that he defines violence. Okay, because he's not necessarily talking about picking up guns and shooting cops or something like that. Okay, he's talking about, he would consider, for example, demonstrations to be the threat of violence. Okay, that you're making a threat that if we're not listened to, this can get uglier. So that the whole of last summer and, the 100 Days of Portland and things like that, most of that wasn't actually nearly as physically violent as the media portrayed it to be. Okay. It's just that you'll notice, I don't know how many of you would get how you would get your news, but if you looked at, say, MSNBC or CNN, not Fox News, but MSNBC or CNN, right, which are allegedly sort of, empathetic with the grievances of Black Lives Matter, for example, you would be surprised to find that they kept playing a lot of the same footage over and over again. Okay, what Fox News was doing was actually playing footage from other demonstrations and riots without explaining that what we're showing you is not what's going on. This isn't Portland, or this isn't, it was really amazing to see that. The point being there can often be this real understanding about the meaning of violence, including, demonstrations and civil disobedience and things like that, what it means, but also the function that it serves in nominally democratic cultures, which is you have to have ways of allowing people to articulate their grievances. This is so when he's talking about totalitarianism, and he's one of the few people who comes close to an assertion that I've always tried to make about totalitarianism, which is those are not necessarily strong states because they're overtaxed. When he starts talking about that notion of private violence and some of the other things he talks about, all of that demands a lot of the state. And what we've seen happen with fascist states, what we saw happen with the Soviet Union, when you are deploying an extraordinary amount of state resources to repress your own people, that seems to me not to be an example of a strong state. That is a state whose strength is derived from its perceived legitimacy, as opposed to rule by terror. Okay, I think that's what he's kind of hinting at. That the totalitarian dilemma is the burden of constant mobilization, constant repression, constant surveillance, and all those limited resources of the state's capacity to govern are directed inward against oppression. And there's also a perverse incentive for people within the state to do what? Root out more oppression, demanding more state resources. You see where that's going? So that's kind of what he's implying. That's the implication of what he's written. What do you think about that? What do you think about this idea of, well, violence is, we're human beings. Societies have violence in them. And, it's not all good violence. It's not just people getting mad and punching each other out. That's not what he's talking about. That's sort of private violence. But this idea of a kind of public directed outrage or indignity, mobilized as a threat to order. When he defines violence, think of it as a tangible threat to order. We will disorder traffic. We will go down to the plaza in Ashland and disorder commerce, by carrying signs and doing those stupid rhyming chants that no one should do anymore because they're asinine and American and silly. They are, in fact, stupid. Okay. But, that, in other words, it's disorderly conduct. There's even usually a local infraction called disorderly conduct. Well, if that disorder is not just, well, I got hammered and I didn't know what I was doing and I threw up on the cop, yeah, that's disorderly conduct and a lot of other things. That's not what he's talking about. What he's talking about is we have a grievance. You have to pay attention. Yeah, Karen, do you have your hand up? Yeah, you do.
Yeah, I work in Botswana and Zimbabwe. They share a border, and we have a camp in both countries, so I'm back and forth. And Zimbabwe is a dictatorship, and the amount of infrastructure that has to go to quelling any cameras at the border and searching, and I mean, it's just on you all the time. Mm-hmm. And that sort of state of paranoia to keep everybody out and to keep information away and to, it's got to be a nightmare to maintain. I never really thought about that. Whereas Botswana, it's just like, come on in, take your pictures, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, Botswana reminds me of Thailand. It's the sort of the Southeast Asian equivalent, in that it counterpoises itself to an absolutist country with nominally left-wing pretensions and all that. I'm thinking Laos here and Vietnam. And Thailand is kind of like, no, we do it all. We got everything here. Anything, you can buy anything. And so there's a permissiveness there. There is, though, also a fairly authoritarian power structure there. But it's not a visibly repressive state in the way, for example, that Laos would be in Southeast Asia, or certainly that Vietnam would be in Southeast Asia, or that Zimbabwe, would be, except that it's on the verge of being a failed state. This is what happens sometimes with failed states. It's one of the things that happened with the Soviet Union. It wasn't just that Ronald Reagan escalated the military confrontation and we deployed resources. Part of that was there was a lot of internal grievance about the 10-year war in Afghanistan that the Soviet Union was systematically losing. Okay. Um, and that destabilized the Soviet economy and it destabilized Soviet society. Drug abuse exploded, a lot of it coming right out of that battlefront, just as it did with the United States and Vietnam. You know, a lot of people came back junkies, you know. Um, those things tax the limited resources of any state. Okay, and that's important, that like military dictatorships that are constantly having to police the streets, um, and also, you know, impose law and enforce law and adjudicate disputes over law, but they're also responsible for infrastructure and they're responsible for education and because they've occupied the government. We're seeing this now in Myanmar. You know, the military takes over the country. Now they got to run the country, and they're showing they're not very good at it. Well, yeah, what a shock. As anything other than a stopgap interim kind of thing, militaries historically are not very good at running countries. They're very good at blowing things up and killing people, but that's not governing. It's sort of like, you know, we confuse campaigns with governance a lot in the United States. They use different resources and they're calibrated to different ends. So for what Nieberg is saying, you know, the idea is this violence needs to be vented in a sense. It's there, it's inevitable. Now, there's a very complex argument that he gets into with the proliferation of systems and the layers and interactions of systems. It's an interesting argument, but it's sort of hyper-institutionalism in a way. That might be a little confusing. If it is, don't worry about it. The point of that, before we move on, is that people can have a lot of institutionally driven interests that pull them in one direction or another. Okay, so the idea there is he's saying, don't expect consensus. Okay, what you look for is compromise. What you look for is, you know, mediation. Or we have these obvious differences. Okay, that's fine. That's an indication of the relative degree of freedom in the society. That's not an unhealthy thing. What's unhealthy is when the state can't be the neutral arbiter in those disputes, but instead has to come down and drop a hammer on them. Okay. Any other observations on that? It's an interesting article. The last question I wanted to ask you, though, why do you think I would include that in a class on terrorism?
It's interesting as like sort of the other end of a lot of it, because the rest of them, like the one that I am going to talk about, like really describes a lot of the violent actions as like bizarre and unthinkable, and not that they aren't necessarily, but this definitely gives a new different type of context that I think is very interesting.
Well, yeah, that's why, because the idea is, you know, it's sort of like saying, well, war is an atrocity. It's a human condition. It's a human state of being. We don't have to like it. You know, I mean, you know, cancer is a human state of being. You know, we don't have to like it, but, you know, it happens to people. Dying is a human state of being. You know, we have to understand that this sort of mythic notion we have of everything's fine and we have to make sure we keep it that way. That's what Nieberg's really responding to. Don't engineer consensus. The only way you can do that is to crush, you know, people. And if you do that, ultimately, that violence is going to compress and it's going to explode. Now, one of the ways it can explode is terrorism. It doesn't justify it, it explains it. And you know, Quinn, you're right. It's like, it's another way of explaining. It's suddenly, it's not irrational. It may be illegal and it may be stupid, but it's not irrational for people to think we don't have any other option. Yeah, Pamela, sorry.
Oh no, it just reminded me, there was actually a quote kind of near the end where he's talking about like voting and elections and that whole part. But he says that many people blithely argue for law as a substitute for violence, as though there were any choice between the two.
Yeah.
Really arguing that like it's the implicit threat of violence is in that realm as well. And that that's kind of what I took from the article, was not even so much like, yeah, there's like these big demonstrations, but those are necessary because it's the threat of it that's like the crux point.
Well, just think of particularly the American law enforcement establishment. is pretty heavily tooled up these days. That's violence. That's what he's talking about too. You know, when cops show up, the first thing that distinguishes them from everyone else is firepower. And, you know, I've only a few times actually seen that firepower used. And it's kind of humbling because you realize they can kind of get away with this, especially before the era of cell phones and things. I mean, there were a couple of times in neighborhoods where cops just came in and shot somebody, you know. Or like, you know, I remember in Nigeria, this is when I was there, that was like 1989. There's a military dictatorship. It was the end of a long day, coming back from Ibadan, going to Ife, and we were going to take the bus. And I didn't really want to because it was super packed and everything else. I see the soldier walk up. He was like a lieutenant, right? He had his sidearm with him. These people were crowding into this bus. Well, he wanted to get on the bus. And these people couldn't get off the bus, so he shot one of them in the foot to get him to get off the bus. Then he got on the bus and it went away, and no one said anything. You know, I mean, you can't have that. You know, sooner or later that breaks down and you have problems, you know. So that's, yeah, that's kind of, you know, the very notion of law implies the threat of violence in order to enforce it. Yeah. Yeah, if you haven't read that yet, give it a look, because I don't think it's just useful for the class on terrorism. It's one of the more interesting articles I've ever used, and I've used it in more than one class, and I think it works really well. All right, what about so-called suicide terror?
Yes. Okay. This one was a lot shorter than last time, which was nice. So sorry. It kind of starts just off the bat with
Hold on,
defining.
one second. Remember, start with, and this is what Pamela did really well.
Okay.
What's the most essential core argument of the piece? The thing that's most important to learn. Then you can kind of walk us through it.
Okay, yeah. So I think this one, like I said, it's really short. It's only 2 pages, and so it's got a pretty condensed argument, and that is basically that there are 2 major causes behind suicide terrorism, and that the main way to stop it from happening is by preventative measures. Like, there's no way to effectively sort of battle it with weaponry, and that the prevention methods and angling to sort of eliminate as much as it is present right now the 2 main factors, which is like anger and hopelessness, and then a deep religious belief that life will be better in paradise, and that causing these acts and sacrificing your life for this cause is a way to get there. So it kind of, that is the central point, is that it defines what drives suicide terror or terrorism, and then how you might go about sort of stopping it from happening. So that would be, I think, like the central argument. And so it kind of starts just by comparing murder and suicide within terrorism and saying how similar they are. And then it also cites some like wartime examples, and then also some biblical examples, like Samson and him causing an action that he knew would result in his death, but would be an act of vengeance that would take 3,000 of the enemy with him. And so that was something that was worth it in his book and in God's book. So it was something that kind of moves forward this idea that suicide terrorism is like, this action causes a greater reaction, and your life is worth more for the cause than just as one person. And so one thing that's really specific to suicide terrorism is that no one plans on surviving those. So like, whether or not you actually succeed at your mission, like, you are not going back from that. You are dying, whether it's just you or it's everybody or every building or what have you. So the plans are very one way. They're it's not like it's something where you really kind of are set in stone and have this core decision that's already been made, and they usually have their wills set up and their families prepared to be taken care of. And so this is another reason that kind of builds to that prevention is the only real way to stop this, because you're not really going to be able to talk someone who has every preparation made and has said their goodbyes out and believes in the cause that they intend to die for. You're not just going to be able to sort of stop them. And with no intention of going home, even if you did, it puts you in the thing of, what do you do now? Because they don't want to be alive, and they've anyway, so there's that whole thing that they talk about, and then they basically talk about just how they're convinced of their immortality and its transcendence into your paradise after this life. And then they briefly touch on the fact that it's unclear if there is any higher a percentage of mental illness in suicide terrorists than in the general population. I thought it was interesting because they brought it up and then they were like, it's unclear. And I was like, okay, not super helpful, but thanks for touching on that. So that was cool. And then, but then they kind of, from there, they talk, they really, or the author really lays into the two major causes behind the suicide terrorism, which is the paranoia of existence in a state, and just the fear and hopelessness of, and the widespread community sort of sharing in that. And then also the deep religious beliefs of this paradise. And so they kind of talk about like the two ways that you might sort of help in these preventative measures, and one of them would be trying to ease this like fear and paranoia that can come with living in states where you are not necessarily in complete agreement with the actions being taken. But then it's also another thing they go into is not necessarily restricting religion, but ensuring that the religion itself isn't corrupted into this body for terrorism, in a sense, and like that the religion isn't run by the fanatics that would kind of lead you into what they called I think it's folie à deux. I don't really speak French, but it's called the madness of two or more. And essentially the author contrasts Al-Qaeda's structure with the concept of madness of two or madness of many. And so the bizarre structure of Al-Qaeda, they compare it to this structure because rather than a shared ideology, it matches rather having the person who is projecting all of this onto like the subject that projects it right back, but you have this central person that is the core of this. And so on the religious side of the preventative measures, it's trying to stop those fanatics that can cause this madness of two or madness of the many from being able to step into that role of power. So I think that's kind of the flyover.
Okay. You can see it's a very, very different approach to trying to analyze this, because it's unclear, first of all, and Quinn, I think you're right. It's really unclear, for example, when he talks about the Une folie à deux, une folie à plaisir, I think it's called. I don't speak French either. I don't care for it. I don't care. I won't make any excuses. But this madness of many, I don't know that it's made clear in the article that that's what causes terrorism, because that makes it sound like it's playing into the kind of pseudo-psychological analysis of these people being a bunch of lunatics in a way. And it's a funny article, because on the one hand, it's like, are you saying that or not? Or when, for example, the idea that, well, what drives people to terrorism, essentially, it's a very elaborate way of saying they become desperate. Well, we already knew that, and desperation isn't just a state of mind. Okay, it is also a state of being. Another thing that I think is not addressed in this particular article is, why should a shared experience of something drive someone to suicide terror rather than to a more affiliative act, like, kind of like what we were talking about with Nieberg, where it's like, yeah, you know what, let's get together and let's go and let's set up a tent city and let's demonstrate. Why does it have to be this thing of, I'm going to blow myself up? I don't really think that to my satisfaction, I don't think that's explained. And I think you can trot out psychology as has been done here, and it can illuminate some things. I'm not sure if that's what's being done here. And I'm trying intentionally to provoke a response if there is one. My growing concern is that most of you haven't had a chance to read these things yet. But I'm going to try and believe that that's not the case, so that, I don't have an anger, hopelessness, or a belief in a better life. And therefore, I won't do anything drastic. Is there a difference, according to this perspective, is there a difference between a murderer who goes and just shoots somebody and a so-called suicide terrorist?
I think in this perspective, it's interesting because at the very start, the author is very explicit in saying how indistinguishable they are, kind of within the realm of terrorism. But then throughout the whole take, you do see them as different things with different motivations. And so I think I would agree that it is a somewhat not incomplete per se, but could be further fleshed out almost with the take on that and the specific.
Well, I think the author is getting caught up in his own statistics. For example, right at the beginning, 1 in 3 murders is followed by suicide. What about the other 66% of murders that aren't? I mean, you see what I'm saying? In other words, you're not helping us, pal. You're just not helping us here. And this is an attempt really to try to say, oh, here's why you should do what you should do in order to try to prevent this. The other thing about this, I mean, we can worry away at that quite a bit, I think, methodologically. I think the more important implication here is when we get to that point of talking about prevention, how do you effectively ease or attenuate, fear or paranoia or desperation? How do you do that? It's one thing to say, well, the way to prevent terrorism is to, attenuate fear and paranoia and desperation. Yeah. Listen, the way to make me solvent financially is to take away my debt. How are you going to do that? And that's an easy one. Rob a bank, But I mean, I don't think do you see any proposal here that's concrete? Where it's like, look, here's where we can get at the problem. Because I don't.
The article itself, really gives an explanation of what you can do to prevent it. But I wonder if, because it does talk about how the suicide terror comes from a place of hopelessness. And I know that it doesn't really talk about it, but I wonder if it comes from a place of hopelessness and sort of you feel for the cause. And if you find an organization that has guaranteed, if you do this for us, we will take care of your family, we will make sure that they're okay. Some people might see that as the only option. If their family is really struggling, then they might be well, this is what I have to do. Even if there was maybe if there was another avenue for them to find that support, they wouldn't they wouldn't go to suicide terrorism.
Well, that's been one of the reasonings behind a lot of the NGO operations, and particularly in South Asia and the Middle East, where that more specifically religiously motivated or apparently religiously motivated terrorist activity seems to occur, is that, look, we need to get on the ground with a civic presence that gives people alternatives to having to go to the radical imam or the radical whatever and enter into that cult-like environment, which that's where the madness of many occurs, is in cults. And I wish that had been clearer, because there is something about the recruiting and retention of the rank and file of terrorism that is very much like a cult. It really is. And that's not really, that doesn't, but again, if we'd acknowledge that, then we say, okay, well, how do you get people out of cults? With difficulty. Sometimes you have to go kidnap them. You actually have to break the law, So I guess I'm a little dubious about the prescription here, because I'm not really sure the diagnosis is something I'm comfortable with. It's a lot of words that seem to say very little in terms of what motive. For example, using the example of Samson. Samson's issue was not that he was depressed or hopeless. He was a heroic figure, but never mind, he didn't exist. But this was a heroic figure. That doesn't have anything to do with the very case being made. These people are essentially the losers in life. Doesn't mean they're bad people. It means they lose, and they keep losing. And beyond a certain point, they can't sustain the loss anymore. How often do we see that with lone usually gunmen in the United States, that they see themselves as losers? I mean, you can look at the violence, and I'm talking about not so much the organized violence behind January 6th, but the people who got vacuumed up into that. A lot of those people really are living, looks like are living pretty aimless, hopeless lives. They're in either small towns or dead-end jobs, or they're in a retirement and they're barely getting by. Nobody cares about them. They're irrelevant. Government doesn't care about them. Corporations don't care about them. Nobody cares about them, which is kind of a fact on the ground. You're right. Nobody cares. Okay. That's not heroic. That's desperate. Okay. But look at how seldom those people carry out those kinds of acts of violence. They're more likely to turn that violence on themselves, usually through aggressive self-medication or dangerous behavior, or on their own families through domestic violence. That's not explained here. So I think the psychology has arguably a role to play here methodologically. Okay, but just as in a later piece we're going to look at, we talk about this notion, and I think it's an unfair rendering, but this notion of what's sometimes called methodological positivism, and the kind of cul-de-sacs of error into which that can lead you. Psychology has the same kinds of problems. Okay, when you find people, we'll do this in a minute, right? When you find people invoking Freud, for example, be very, very skeptical. Okay, keep in mind that Freud was making it up as he was going along. There's absolutely no record I'm aware of him ever actually curing anyone, or even really treating effectively anyone. Okay, you know why? Because he was making it up. He was fudging data. I mean, Freud was one of the most titanic frauds of the last 100 years in many ways. However, as a consequence of his fraudulence and the sort of inhibitions that broke down methodologically, a lot of other people became genuine, authentic innovators. Okay, so I'm not disparaging psychology. It's just that I think sometimes people get bogged down in this kind of orthodoxy or what they think psychology ought to be or something, and they don't help us very much. Right? Anything else on that? It's a frustrating little article, but again, it generally stimulates a lot of thought once you read it. And that's a short one I would expect everyone to read. I think when we get to the point where people are doing their written assignments, I expect that one to pop up a lot, because it's like 2.5 pages or whatever it is, 3 pages. All right, anything else? Okay, what about, let me make another, I just want to make one more note here. Sorry, I got to turn off the microphone because it's. Okay, what about the idea of lone actors? Now, this is a little different from our discussion of suicide terror, right? Because suicide terror implies, no, you've been recruited actively as the rank and file of an organization, as opposed to a lone actor, sometimes referred to as self-radicalized. Okay, what is this article, what, if anything, can this article teach us about, sorry for the noise, teach us about understanding, this enigmatic phenomenon of the lone actor terrorist? Whoever wants to start there can.
So this article, the authors, they sort of just explain a lot of like the characteristics and the behaviors of lone actor terrorists leading up to like the planning, the conducting of their terrorist event. The definition of terrorism used in this article is defined as the use or threat of action where the use or threat is designed to influence the government or to intimidate the public or section of the public, and or the use or threat is made for the purpose of advancing a political, religious, or ideological cause. So with this article, the authors, they just collect a lot of data, and the data that they do collect is on 119 individuals who engaged in or plan to engage and these lone actor terrorism in the US and Europe. These individuals, the authors examined that they got these names of these people that were engaged in these terrorism events in like a sort of dictionary produced by the LexisNexis. It's like a code book that they sort of gathered this project from to use for this this article.
LexisNexis is an index of full text copies of news articles and transcripts from television.
Yes, so they use that in combination with the global terrorism database to develop like the study of terrorism and response to terrorism. So that helped them like get the list of those convicted of terrorism related offenses in the UK and the United States. So the authors, they examined a lot of like the ideologies, ideological things such as gender, the age of first terrorist activity, relationship status and family engagement, education, employment, criminal activity, mental health. They just go on a lot about the different percentages of people who were involved in this lone actor terrorism. Oh gosh. Anyways, gender. So they found that about 96.6% of those individuals were males. There was only 3.4% being females. And the interesting thing that the authors did explain, they shared that one of the females, her name was Roshanara Qadri. She stabbed a Labour Party MP by the name of Stephen Timms. The reason why she did that was for revenge because they supported the Iraq war and the subsequent deaths of innocent people within Iraq. The other individual, that was a female by the name of Rochelle Shannon. She shot Dr. George Tiller outside of an abortion clinic. And she was also linked to like other activities that performed attacks against 9 other abortion clinics. So these, some of these examples shared by the authors, they sort of give us an idea of like the motivation and purpose behind some of these terrorist attacks. And other examples that the author does offer is the incident with the terrorist event with Ellis Hust and Joseph Bailey. Both of
Okay,
these men.
let me just stop you there because for our purposes, we don't need to worry about the individual cases.
Okay.
The last thing that we want to do is extrapolate from any individual case in terms of what we're doing now. So the more important thing, I mean, you've got us going on this, you've got us started. They set up a study. They had this large database with a lot of information about these people who carried out these lone act terrorist actions or whatever you want to call them. Okay. So, and I know, Rachel, I don't know if you want to step in here or not, because like Madeline's given us a good start. If we wanted to draw conclusions from their study, what do we learn? Particularly, what do we learn that we might not have anticipated? Look at the big variables. Like most people assume that, you know, the lone actor is alienated, is mentally ill, is relatively ignorant, not always terribly bright. And yet, when you look at some of these variables, that sort of mythic profile doesn't seem to work. What do we learn when we analyze the data that Manuel was talking about, and we try to draw some conclusions? She set you up, so now you can bring it in for a landing.
So basically, like the author of this article broke it up into a few different categories. So first, there was there was individual terrorists that are completely independent, like of a group. They're just operating on their own accord. And then there's individual terrorists with command and control links that are on their own, but they're trained and equipped by like a group. And then the last category is isolated dyads, which are pairs of individuals who operate individually, like independently of a group. And then further, it's broken up by 3 different ideologies. And so there's like right-wing terrorists and then single issue terrorists that are operating just based on like abortion or environmentalism or animal rights and stuff like that. And then there's Al-Qaeda related ideologies, which are completely separate than the other 2. And interestingly, it was showing that there was differences between the ideologies of like people's social isolation and their education. Like it said that over half of the people that carried out the lone actor terrorist attacks were considered socially isolated by the like coded open source accounts. But in terms of the ideologies, the Al-Qaeda related terrorist, like lone actor terrorists, were much more likely to have a college education, even a PhD. They were also more likely to be significantly younger than the right-wing or single issue cohorts. And then the right-wing like terrorists were significantly less likely to have had any sort of university education. They were significantly less likely to be like a professional or to have children. And they were also much more likely to be based out of the United States and much more likely to successfully execute their terrorist attacks. And basically, like the main conclusion of the whole article was that there isn't really a uniform profile of lone actor terrorists, excluding the profile of being men. But any further than that, there wasn't really like any specific profile that you could make. And while many of them were isolated, not all of them were isolated, and the ones that were isolated were not prolonged isolation. It was like a period of isolation right before they committed their terrorist attack or planned to commit their terrorist attack. And the conclusion that the author made was that we shouldn't be focusing on trying to break them up into different socio-demographic characteristics, and we should be rather analyzing their behavior as a whole.
Okay, that's an interesting point, the last part of that. In other words, don't profile. But when you say, think of something about their, what do you do? If you don't profile them, what are you supposed to do?
Yeah, it was saying that like most of the lone actor terrorists engaged in things before they committed their offense that were detectable. Like they 68% of the cases that they looked at were showing that the individual read or consumed literature or propaganda associated with a wider movement, even if they weren't involved in the wider movement themselves. And also there was evidence to suggest that some of them had been isolated from a wider movement, like they had at one point been involved in a larger terroristic movement, but they had since been like kicked out of that. And so things like that are indicators that you can use to figure out, to analyze whether or not someone might be a lone actor terrorist, and those are more able to determine that than just the characteristics of someone.
They're more predictive. So the idea here is, if you want to begin to kind of zero in on people who might pursue these kinds of activities, the best way to do that then is to try and be aware of, for example, think of this criminologically, because how many of you are criminology majors? I think 3 of you, 2 or 3 of you are crim majors, or crim minors at least. Yeah, criminologically, the thing to think about is, okay, how do we find these people before they hurt somebody? You don't always. But what you can do is like take seriously what they say. So look for their social networking presence, look for their kind of internet presence and things like that. And this is why like the FBI, for example, regularly monitors not just right-wing extremist sites, but all sorts of extremist sites nationally. Okay. Now they have to be careful about that because people do have an extraordinary amount of freedom and license to say, all kinds of things. They can't advocate violence necessarily, but they can express themselves pretty emphatically and pretty intolerantly. If you're monitoring that, though, even though some of those things might be anonymous, if you have the right data analysis approach, you can begin to collate things. It's very hard to do, and it's something that's almost always done after the fact. Okay, but that's what they're kind of saying, I think, is you've got to look at their behavior. You can't just, and now again, this is going to become important when we look at, I think Jason's going to take us through that article, Born Radicals, because that's critiquing the profiling approach by saying, look, just because somebody, who has Middle Eastern origin suddenly grows a beard doesn't mean they're getting ready to blow people up or stab them in the street. Sorry, something just fell off the table here. That was kind of cool. That happened really slowly. Look at those lightning reflexes for an older man. Anyway, there's a danger in doing that kind of, particularly through dodgy surveillance and stuff, trying to intrude on people's privacy and monitor their appearance or monitor maybe some of their behaviors that aren't in themselves criminal at all, and begin to collate artificially and think, okay, now we got it. You don't do that. What they're trying to say here is, I think one of the striking things is the variety of levels of education. Okay, the notion of the alienated, kind of undereducated, lone gun nut kind of thing, insofar as it applies, it's almost all right-wing terrorism, and in places like the United States or other industrial countries. Because you're left out of things, you are excluded from things because there's a clear ceiling above which you can't go in terms of employment. You're seen as less desirable in terms of meeting people and making families and keeping relationships together, because again, it's that idea of being and seeing yourself as a loser. But that doesn't apply, for example, to Al-Qaeda. It doesn't apply to the Islamic State. It doesn't apply. Those people, many of them are highly skilled. They have a lot of military experience. They have logistical knowledge. They're very smart, and their grievances are different. Okay, they're not just alienated. Okay, they're pissed off, but they're pissed off and outraged on behalf of people. Now, they may also be opportunists who are trying to use a terrorist organization to achieve status or to enhance the status that they have. That's left out of this cohort, and I think it's very important in terms of the leadership of these organizations. These are status seekers. They really are. But I'm not making fun. I'm just saying it's another thing to think about. People would aspire to form an organization like this and go through all that work to maintain it because it gives them status, gives them the feeling that they're doing important work, whether it's the Lord's work or Hitler's work or whoever's work. They're doing important work, and they're going to transform society, and they're going to burn away the impurities and do all this kind of stuff. You can see where that's not so much mental illness, although it is a little bit monomaniacal, okay? But there is a kind of reason in that. If you can think inside that head and think, oh, yeah, from the point of view of your grievances, your history or the history of your people, yeah, okay, this isn't going to work, but I can see why you're doing it. And again, this is where a lot of people become confused and say, well, I've heard this all the time, I haven't heard it recently, but I used to hear it all the time when I first started teaching this class. I'd hear from students and they'd be like, so you're justifying terrorism? I think I mentioned that on the first day of class. No, I'm not. But if we don't try to understand it and get into their heads and find out what they think their grievances are or what's motivating them, then we can't do anything to stop it. And ultimately, you know, we're not going to stop it. You're not going to win a war on terror, because terror is something that's constantly being imposed by states. And so from time to time, again, asymmetrical warfare, people with profound grievances are going to try to use that weapon of terror using the limited asymmetrical resources they have. That's a constant. I think that's kind of the implication of Niebuhr's model is, that's a constant. That's not going away. And so saying that you're going to declare war on that, it's sort of like a war on drugs. We can see all the good that's done. I mean, when you shoot and kill people for drug offenses, you're losing the war. It's like, think of the analog to that being the United States military in Vietnam burning down villages. Okay, you're losing the war because you're losing the trust of the very people you say you're fighting by destroying their lives, And so this is important in terms of counterterrorism. This idea that, well, why do they think? Maybe they're wrong. Okay, they're wrong. That's fine. Why do they think they're right? Okay, so it's something to keep in mind. I think it's an interesting art. What do you think about that? As Madeline was saying, a lot of data, a lot of numbers to crunch, but it's an interesting approach. Or perhaps not.
I thought it was an interesting article. It was different than a lot of the articles that you have us read because it was so number heavy and less like analytical. Like the most of the analysis just came at the very end of it.
Yeah. I kept that one in because I think the numbers can put people off a bit, but it's really important for us to see, oh, this is how they're thinking the way they're thinking. They're basing this on they're being as obvious as they can about what their methods are and what they're basing their conclusions on. Now, if you notice, some of these are other articles, they're just kind of speculating. Karen, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I was just going to say the thing that I appreciated about that article, and I think that we kind of see borne out a little bit after January 6th, is that the friends and the family of that person who has decided to act in this manner, they knew there were signs, there were grievances, they knew their ideology, they sort of knew how seriously they were taking this. And a lot of people who've been turned in after January 6th were turned in by their family because they'd been hearing this ideology. They had known that this, that this was escalating, and they decided to come forward. The fact that they didn't do beforehand doesn't really help us prevent that type of thing, but it does, I think, play to the theory that, if you notice someone is off, try to help them or understand them or alert somebody.
Well, one of the things that was obviously an important, an important component of this was that you had the President of the United States advancing a completely fraudulent myth about the election. Well, particularly if you voted for this person, you're in a little bit of a psychological dilemma, right? And there's a little cognitive dissonance here because what are you going to do? Shut down the person you voted for? And plan to vote for again? Maybe voted for twice. So it poses a problem for people to say, oh, wait a minute, this guy in this one, sorry, you're full of crap here. This is nonsense. This is bad fiction kind of stuff. This is Tom Clancy novel stuff. This deep state stuff. And then, of course, playing into that, this notion of QAnon. Those things are on their face absurd. Okay. They're lunatic kind of things. It makes me nervous, though, really nervous as a social scientist, right? Insofar as I am, when I listened to the news during that period of time, the number of times that I heard these nominally progressive, empathetic news hacks use words like crazy and nuts and lunatic. And I thought, boy, profiling much, it's really, again, it's that idea that, well, yeah, what's crazy? What I disagree with, what those people do. You know, I mean, Nazi Germany was not about shared insanity. It was an astonishing capacity to deny reality. You know, and we're seeing that. We see that a lot. I mean, you're seeing it everywhere right now. One of the points that I made in the I think it was in yesterday's comparative class. We were talking something about democracy. And I said, look, democracy is under more direct assault right now than it was during the Cold War. The big fear during the Cold War wasn't democracy. It was the Soviet Union because it had nuclear weapons. That's a rational fear. Okay. But what we're seeing now is a lot of people all over the world who in one way or another are manifestly anti-democratic. They don't like democracy. And part of that is, in terms of, this is why some of you might have been, why did they keep looking at ideology? Why did they keep looking at ideology? One of the reasons for that is if you think about core beliefs that people have, the more conservative you are in your beliefs, the more propensity you have to be authoritarian, okay? To believe in a strict hierarchy of authority, okay? And to see your place in that hierarchy. That is maybe to concede there are leaders above me and I'm waiting for them to tell me what to do. There are inferiors below me, all right, who threaten my safety or who mow my lawn or whatever, right? I mean, that is a much more conservative view of the world. It does not mean that there are not bigoted progressives. Walk around Ashland on any sunny day. But that notion of, that right-wing nationalism and stuff like that, okay, that's radical traditionalism. White supremacy, that's radical traditionalism. Again, am I justifying it? No, it's insupportable, but I know why it's there. Particularly if you're in a small town, right? And you're watching Fox News and somehow over the transom comes something to do with LGBTQ rights or diversity or something like that. And I mean, you're very conservative in your social views and you're very isolated from these rapid transformations that are happening in your own country. All of a sudden, you're living in a different country. Okay. So part of this notion, this gets us back again to Niebuhr, is not everybody's looking at the same world the same way. Well, this also applies to extremists. They're not all looking at the same world that we're looking at. It doesn't mean they're crazy. It means they're isolated, or they're niched together in a cohort of some kind, something like that. We got to pay attention to these things because, I mean, you're hearing the United States Justice Department right now saying that the single biggest threat to American democracy right now is right-wing extremism within the United States. I'm going to argue they're right. It is, because it's a fundamentally anti-democratic movement. It wants to impose absolutist authority, the extreme version of which is theocracy. The very same people who attack, the tyranny of the state want that state to crush the people they see beneath them. Absolutely. It's completely authoritarian. When you think about the Trump administration, that is the most fundamentally authoritarian administration we have seen in my life. Okay. And that's why when people think, well, why were you afraid of Trump? They're not afraid of Trump. Trump's not scary. But the things that Trump stirs up and your ability to harness those to your political advantage, you don't want to lose those. The embodiment of those things, the kind of Macy's Day balloon floating through the parade, is Donald Trump. But there's no substance to him in this case. It doesn't matter. Symbolically, he embodies a certain kind of bitter, angry traditionalism, okay, that plays with a constituency, in parts of the Deep South and Middle America in particular, okay? And so that's why they would believe, for example, oh, well, they just cheated on the election. And that they would actually instigate astonishing violence in the absence of any verifiable data proving their case. They just didn't need it. They were ready to believe. Okay, there's a notion of the so-called true believer. These are true believers. Okay, so that there's a lot of that. And clearly that's the case with people who are violent extremists. Okay, all right, we're doing pretty good for time. We may not be able to get all of these done. In fact, we are at a point now. We've got 2 to go. We could carry over next week, and then I could do the overview for the next module next week, and we would essentially be delaying the assignment. Or we could try to power through and finish today. What's the energy level like? I can do either one. In my 355 yesterday, we agreed everyone was tired. And so we had, I think, 2 more readings, 2 more presentations to do. We're going to do them next week. But if you want to power through, we can do that too. I'll leave it up to you. What do you think? Democracy.
The only thing for me is that I might not be able to make class next week because I'll be out of town and I just don't know where I'll be. So.
Okay.
And I'm presenting on one of the articles.
Yeah.
I vote for putting it off. I have about no energy today. So like anything to like procrastinate it is like awesome sounding right now.
Okay, Simone's saying next week. I just don't want to burn you out. Jason, what we can do, there are a couple of things we can do, all right? Because you were going to present, which meant you weren't going to have to write a full paper, did you do notes? Okay.
Yes.
If you can email to me a pretty coherent summary of that article, the notes you would have used in that presentation, if you can't make it next week,
Okay. Yeah.
then
that'll work.
I would accept that as the assignment. Does that seem fair?
That's totally fair. Yes. Thank
No,
you.
I mean, I'm asking your cohort. I know you
Oh.
think it's fair. Okay, I mean, I think that's okay. I do think the presentations are good. It's just that I kind of like to end on a high note. Sometimes I feel like we push a little too far and then everybody's kind of down and kind of tired. This material is useful, but if we try to cram too much in our heads at one time, it starts chasing the other stuff out. I really liked the discussions. I think everybody did a good job. I'm not concerned about that at all. But I don't have any problem sort of slowing things down. I mean, we're like at that halfway point. It's like the Wednesday of the term, you know? We're kind of like almost in the middle of the term, and everybody's kind of, you know, the weather got warm and then it got cold, then it got warm and it can't figure out what it wants to do and all that. So we're in good shape. I think we're moving through the material well from a combination of, you know, comments I hear, the presentations, you know, things like that. It seems like most of you are getting most of the material. So I think we're in a pretty good place. You know, this is kind of like, okay, then I'm going to give you a present. We can have a shorter day. Does that sound good? All right, so we'll finish up with the implicit motives article and the born radicals article in one form or another. Jason, if you can't make it, then for purposes of the class, I may take that on myself. Just for purposes of the class. But if you can make it, that would be great. If you can't, I would say don't worry about it. You know, we've all got a lot of things we've got to do.
I think I'll know more sooner or closer to next week. So if I know for a fact I won't make it, I'll email you.
Yeah, I'm just saying it's not something you should be worrying about. You know, just if you're here, you can do it. If you're not, I'll do it, and then you can. I guess you could just upload really to Moodle in lieu of the assignment. You could just say, "Here are my notes," you know, and I'll just evaluate those as I would have done the presentation. Anything else? All right, then I will see you all. Well, presumably I will see all or most of you next week. Okay.
Awesome.
All right. Nice job today. This is a good class.
Thank you.